The oldest and strongest human emotion is fear, and the oldest and strongest type of fear is trepidation of the unknown. When we were children, our parents told us that monsters didn't exist, but we were sure that something was lurking under the bed or in the closet. Fear sees, even if our eyes are closed. Welcome to the realm of the Arcane. My name is Lon Strickler. Join me as I examine unexplained creatures, strange manifestations, and remarkable realities. Imagine this next hour as a voyage of discovery to strange lands, seeking not for new territory, but for new knowledge of the supernatural. Come on board as we begin this adventure together. Hey folks, good evening and welcome to another episode of Arcane Radio. I'm your host, Lon Strickler, and I thank you for joining me here on the Paranormal King Radio Network. Listeners can now show their support for Arcane Radio by becoming a patron. Simply go to Phantoms and Monsters at phantomsandmonsters.com and click the Podbean patron banner. Now, before I introduce my guest, I want to mention an account I recently received. I got a very interesting phone call from an eyewitness who I'll call WA, or I'll just say Wayne, in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Now, this is in reference to an incident that occurred in 1973 in Douglasville, Georgia, as well as continued UFO encounters, culminating to present-day humanoid sightings in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Now, in 1973, Wayne was in the backseat of his mother's car with his brother. They were traveling south on Powder Spring Highway towards Douglasville, Georgia, one early evening at dusk. They began to notice cars speeding by them and driving recklessly. In fact, they witnessed one car careen off the road and flip into a nearby field. The boys looked out the back window and observed a huge saucer-shaped craft hovering behind their car. Their mother hit the gas and headed directly to their home on Hickory Road in the Hickory Estates in Douglasville, Georgia. Now, they quickly exited the car and rushed inside, the boy's mother telling them to go to the room upstairs and to stay there. She called the local police to report what had happened, and the police were very busy taking other calls from local residents reporting a flying craft over the neighborhood. When the boy's mother got off the phone, she heard loud noises coming from the roof. She yelled for the boys to come downstairs, fearing that they may be in danger. All three ran outside and witnessed three short-statured beings dressed in white NASA-like spacesuits without helmets, which were standing on top of the roof. Now, Wayne stated that these beings looked perfectly human, with regular facial features and slanted eyes. They stood still and looked directly at Wayne and his family. They quickly went back into the house waiting for police. When the police arrived, they demanded that the families in the neighborhood stay indoors as they investigated the situation. Apparently, the police told the boy's mother that they witnessed the three beings and that the federal authorities were on the way. Now, in the meantime, Wayne and his brother were in their shared bedroom. About the same time the police came into their house, one of these beings came through the wall into the bedroom. It didn't say anything, but Wayne said that we had a strange sensation and possibly lost time, a small period of lost time. The brothers were paralyzed during the encounter and couldn't react. When the being exited through the wall, they regained their faculties and screamed, running downstairs to the mother and the police. One of the officers quickly went upstairs but found nothing. A few hours later, that same evening, federal authorities arrived and questioned the families in the neighborhood, including Wayne and his family. Now, Wayne remembers that his father, who had been at work during the incident, was annoyed that federal authorities were in his home. His father always maintained that the entire incident was some sort of mass hysteria and actually punished his sons when they'd mentioned the incident. After the encounter, Wayne had an oozing sore develop on his ear. It never healed and eventually started to expand in size until a year later, a small, hard, chip-like object object broke through the skin. He showed the object to his father, who immediately threw the object in the trash and punished Wayne severely. About the same time, and Wayne recalls it to be in the summer, Wayne and his brother spent the night outside the back of his father's open pickup truck. As they gazed into the night, the same saucer-shaped craft descended from above and hovered above them. Wayne is positive that they lost time during this encounter. These occasional UFO encounters have continued over the years. Now, fast forward to current time, Wayne lives in Fort Lauderdale, Florida now. Now, he has witnessed upside-down funnel-shaped craft descending from the ocean at different times. He also reports that there have been humanoids seen throughout the Fort Lauderdale area recently. He had a strange encounter with two women who he swears were not completely human because they were quite tall and had unusual facial features. Now, Wayne talked to other residents in the general area who have witnessed bizarre humanoids. Now, this is an interesting scenario because I received a report of an unknown large humanoid seen and photographed from the backyard of the witness, who was a local teacher, and his daughter. As they arrived home, the humanoid was hanging onto a utility pole. They described it as thickened body, muscular, and the face was undistinguishable. The being moved slightly back and forth, and this was in the Lauderdale Estates and occurred on June 15, 2018. It was early evening, and the photograph was quickly captured by the daughter on her cell phone. Now, the Families of Monsters Fortean research team has attempted to adjust the light on the image in order to make it more visible. We had determined, though, through area measurements from later photographs, that the being was at least 8 foot in height in a crouching-like position. Now, if you want to go to the blog, the photograph, the original photograph and the life-adjusted photograph are posted on the blog. It's very interesting. So let's get started. Tonight's guest, Joshua Cutchin, is a Fortean researcher and author. Joshua is a North Carolina native with a long-standing interest in Forteana. He holds a master's degree in music literature and a master's in journalism from the University of Georgia. He is also a published composer and maintains an active performance schedule as a jazz and rock tuba player, having appeared on 8 albums and live concert DVDs. Joshua has written 3 well-received books, including his latest title, Thieves in the Night, A Brief History of Supernatural Child Abductions. You can find his website at joshuacutchin.com. So, Josh, thanks for joining me.
Lon, it's an absolute pleasure. You know, there are certain people that I was listening to long before I first set proverbial pen to paper writing any of this stuff. And you know, I remember back in the days of BTE radio, listening to you and everybody. And so it's always a pleasure to get to talk to somebody and make that leap from listener to guest. So thank you so much for having me on.
Well, it's great to have you. And, you know, I've been enthused with your books in the past, and this latest it's interesting. It's different. You know, it's unlike anything I've ever read before. You know, it attempts to compare paranormal child abductions from antiquity through the modern era. And, you know, it focuses on the fairy folklore and alien abductions phenomena, and particularly means and motivations behind kidnappings. So there's a lot of other things involved too, and this goes as far as global traditions, Sasquatch abductions, and you know, the well-known disappearances in national parks that Dave Pilates has covered in the 411 books of his. So tell me a little bit about the book. What motivated you to write the book in the first place?
Yeah, it's a bit of a large data set to look at.
Yeah.
I guess the main reason, you know, my last 2 books were on the role of food and drink in these paranormal encounters, and then the one prior to this one was about smells and different paranormal encounters, ghosts, UFOs, Bigfoot, etc. And so everyone was expecting me to do a book on sound or something, some sort of other sensory thing, and I just wanted to zig when everybody else thought I was going to zag, just to keep it fresh. But the real impetus behind it is that I've always had a real soft spot and interest in fairy lore, and especially specifically that sort of Jacques Vallée, Chris Albeck sort of way, and that fairy lore and particularly the modern UFO phenomena, or at least abduction accounts, to be more specific, overlap. I've long believed that anything that you see in fairy lore, you will find an analog for in abduction literature, and vice versa. Not ufology necessarily, because I'm much more open to the idea of the extraterrestrial hypothesis than I was at one point, but I've always felt that you can find these comparisons if you look closely enough at these two seemingly different phenomena. But the one thing that I never really reconciled with in that sort of paranormal worldview I had was the concept of the hybrid program, and sort of the idea of the fairy changeling. And so really what this was trying to basically take a step back and find these motifs of child abduction from every continent, but with a particular focus on the British Isles, and unpack all of this, try to make it sort of your one-stop shop of changeling lore specifically, and of sort of preventative methods to keep your children being taken by the fairies, and then to walk that through step by step, sort of the motifs that have reared their head in the modern abduction experience. It's not a perfect match, but there are definitely some things that I think are worthy of consideration.
Well, let's talk about the changing phenomena. Now, where did it originate, and does it occur in modern era?
Well, it's so for anyone who's interested in sort of the background on the fairies, which might help sort of put this in perspective, our traditional view that we have of the fairies, of this sort of Tinkerbell-like tiny person with wings, are very much a product of late 18th century children's books and whatnot. The actual idea of the fairies yes, they were generally short, but they were often quite nasty. And one of the things that they loved to do was steal children. And one of the most common means by which they stole children was by replacing a child with a changeling. Depending on the literature, depending on the region, the changeling usually was one of three things. Least common, but not uncommon enough to not warrant mention, is the stock or fetch, which is sort of like a lifeless, inanimate hunk of wood or like a log that's been cloaked with fairy glamour to appear as a child, but it just sort of lays there in the bed. The second thing that they would replace the child with, which you'll find more commonly, was a sick fairy baby. The most common thing that you find in this literature is an elderly fairy man. So they would take the human child back to fairyland for a variety of different reasons. Commonly, the most common reasons that you hear about are to sort of re-inject the fairy bloodline with some extra vigor by bringing in, new genetic material from the human race. And they would have one of these three imposters left in the place of the human child. In certain cases, this sort of served a dual-purpose role in fairy society, because not only did they, the human bloodline pulled into the fairy bloodline, but the sick fairy baby would actually get the nourishment of human milk, which was actually the only sort of sustenance that would help them grow. Fairy food in a lot of traditions is generally considered a sham. Once the glamour is removed, it appears as leaves and sticks and worms and just junk. So by extension, fairy milk is a sham, so fairy babies need human milk. So in the place, no matter what it was, if it was a stock or a fairy baby or an elderly fairy man, this imposter left in the crib would cry incessantly, would show signs of stunted development, would eat more than anyone else in the household, and would just generally bring about sort of bad luck. They were generally listless and wouldn't move about much, unless you happened to spy them when they thought they were all alone, in which case they would dance around merrily and play on the pipes and such things. Sort of the changeling, the sort of changeling motif in a nutshell. It varies from culture to culture, and of course within that you have means of how to prevent this from happening. What happens with your child if you do get a changeling? How do you get rid of it? And then of course the more pragmatic issues of what were these stories also describing some real life medical conditions even if there is a supernatural component to some of these stories, at least some of them seem to be touching upon actual developmental disabilities as well. So just trying to unpack all that. Have we got another 2 hours here, Lon? Or?
Yeah, really. Just go ahead. I mean, I tell you, this book has got a lot of different things in there I had never heard of. And in fact, I was really interested when you started talking about these fairy and wee folk child abductions, and in particular where it's stated that they prefer unbaptized children.
Yeah, that was, generally speaking, among the means of preventing fairy abductions, that was the most potent. You had other things like placing iron in the crib, some really horrifying ones about, one of the favorite ones I like to talk about was the idea that if you dangled the point of a knife just above your child's face in the crib, it would somehow prevent them from fairy abduction. But generally speaking, baptism was the most surefire way of keeping your children safe from the fairies. If you look at this from a sort of folkloric view, and for anybody who's wondering and isn't familiar with my work, I sit somewhere at the intersection of there being an objective reality to these things, sort of a supernatural reality, but also I think that folklore and culture plays a huge role in these things as well. It's interesting. You look at sort of this period between birth and baptism, and that's sort of a liminal period in a child's life. They're born into the human world, but not into the Christian world. So they're sort of in that liminal space, which generally is where paranormal things tend to dwell. I mean, you look at, that's the reason that trolls are under bridges, rather. It's the reason that you sell your soul to the devil to gain great guitar skills at the crossroads at midnight. Like these are the motifs that you see, which I think, again, not only is folklorically important, but you actually see this in modern reports too about people being in, for example, travel is another time. That's a liminal period. You're neither one place nor another. You're in the period of traveling, and that's why you see roadside crossings and stuff. There's something about whatever this phenomena is that's really attracted to liminality. So that was one of the things that you could do is as soon as your child was born, have it, baptized ASAP, because otherwise you're sort of surrendering domain of it to these supernatural forces.
Overall, how much did religion play into these mythologies?
It's curious. You don't find the changeling motif per se in any legends that predate the appearance of Christianity in the British Isles. Like I said, there are similar motifs of this child substitution that you'll find in the Middle East and in Africa. We're setting aside those, just looking at sort of the Ireland, Scotland, England constellation here. So it's almost as if in that part of the world, it was solely the introduction of this motif by Christianity. I mean, actually, the actual term changeling appeared in early Christian writings, and the concept was actually sort of introduced to Christendom back around the 13th century. William of Auvergne, a Parisian bishop, actually talked about the idea that incubi demons would actually take human children and leave behind what he called cambio, which is from the Latin word cambiti, meaning the exchanged. So even though you'll find that this motif in some Christian cultures, it really, really concretized in that part of the world around Christianity, to the extent that Martin Luther actually claimed to have seen and touched a changeling himself. So you don't get much more highly placed in the Protestant faith really than Martin Luther. But it's interesting because as much as you sort of want to blame for lack of a better term, blame this on sort of Christianity corrupting these pagan concepts, it's the roots seem to go even deeper than that, because in another Abrahamic religion, Islam, you'll actually find stories that sound like they're right out of Ireland about the jinn taking human babies and replacing them with their own offspring, and the means by which you got your children back, in this scenario, are almost exactly the same. Some of the things that you would do to prevent your children from being taken are almost exactly the same. Both in Ireland and in certain parts of the Middle East, you would actually dress your male child as a female, because it was generally considered that the fairies wanted to abduct little boys and they wanted to abduct little girls.
That's what I liked about this book, because you started back to Lilith and other deities mentioned the Abrahamic and Sumerian beliefs, up to the current day legends, which I guess you can include Slender Man. I mean, it's just a lot of different things in there. I encourage anybody and everybody to read this book, because if if you are interested in this type of thing, you've got about everything you can think of in this book. It's very interesting.
Well, I really appreciate that, Alon. It means a lot coming from you.
This now you did talk about the methods used to discourage child abduction. And the abductions, for the most part, from what you believe or from what you've researched, is for to obtain new blood and rigor in hybrids. What about infanticide? How much does that have to do with it?
Yeah, so one of the things that if you read enough of these changeling stories, it becomes incredibly and soberingly apparent that some of them are describing people with actual developmental disabilities that were just generally seen as a drain on the family. I mean, you've got to look at the sort of time period, and especially the place where this lore flourished, like Ireland, and how many people were oppressed and living in poverty, and the idea of having an extra mouth to feed that wasn't going to contribute to working in the fields, that wasn't going to help, sort of earn their way, for lack of a better term, and it becomes a real reality. And so part of what I try to do in this book is to go through the different candidates that there were, because everybody wants to pin changelings on one sort of medical condition. There are several. And in fact, it probably was a combination of these things. Plus, I suspect that in some cases there was an actual paranormal / supernatural angle, which I try to make sure that that's abundantly clear. But back to your original point about infanticide, it was astonishingly common in Ireland. And if you wanted to get rid of this child for whatever reason, you could say that you were just trying to put the fairy out of it, or that you were trying to get your own child back because you suspected that it was a changeling. People actually were found not guilty in certain cases of killing children because they thought that they were trying to put their house back in order with their actual child. To sort of put this in perspective, there's an incredibly sobering statistic that I always bring up. There is a scholar named Elaine Farrell who wrote this book called A Most Diabolical Deed. And in her survey and analysis, she looked at a 50-year time period, 1850 to 1900. And during that period, the cases that she found of children who were killed less than 3 years old over 50 years was over 4,500 cases of child murder. And this is on an island that's about the size of Indiana, to sort of put that in perspective. So, and again, if a child was 3 and a half years old, they didn't get included in her survey in this particular time period. So it was astonishingly, tragically common.
I also found interesting where you had in there about the restoration after an abducted child was retrieved. Can you go into that a little bit?
I mean, yeah. So sort of playing off this, I mean, it reminds you a lot of the witch hunts, and the fact that to prove that you weren't some sort of inhuman other, that sometimes the means by which you were brought back would actually kill you. Oh, well, I guess it wasn't a changeling after all, but the kid's dead. And you'll find basically all of them center around abuse, because the primary logic was that the fairy folk would see one of their own being mistreated and go into rush to rescue them. So you'll find things like simple beatings. You'll find things like taking hot iron pokers and burning the child or branding the child. You'll find people who literally would bake children above a fireplace or put them on a griddle, because the idea was that the changeling would rush up the chimney and left on your doorstep would be your own human child. Children were splashed in the face with urine. The administration of foxglove, which is digitalis, it's actually a poison, would be put either in the ear or under the tongue or any sort of things like that. So basically, if it caused pain, it was generally considered a way to expel the changelings. Now, having said this, there were of course more benign methods as well. One of the things that you'll often find is this motif called the brewery of eggshells. And the reason it's called the brewery of the eggshells is that, generally speaking, it was believed that changelings were old fairy men, right? So the idea would be to get them to not act like a child and somehow betray their age. And the best way to do this was to do something nonsensical. So you'll see this method of, if you want to simplify it the most, you have this changeling child watching its foster mother, for lack of a better term, arranging some sort of small vessels and putting food stuff in it. So the way this often plays out is a mother will put porridge in a bunch of eggshells, and the changeling will watch it and eventually say something like, this makes neither sense nor I've seen the acorn before the oak, but this makes neither sense nor joke, speaking in this sing-songy pattern, which says that, hey, I'm really old. Sometimes they'd say, I've been around 4,000 years and I've never seen such bizarre behavior of someone trying to make porridge and eggshells. And of course, you'll find different variations on this. Sometimes it's not eggshell. Sometimes it's shellfish. Sometimes it's acorns. Sometimes it's not porridge. Sometimes it's just simply boiling water. Sometimes it's heating oil. But the idea is to do something so nonsensical that the changeling has to remark. There's a common variant that you'll find in the Arctic Circle where you were supposed to lash together rods to form this gigantic spoon that literally goes from the porridge pot all the way up the chimney. And at that point, the changeling will say that, I was here before this forest was born, and I was here before this lake had formed, but I've never seen such a long spoon in all my years. And at that, either you could start beating it or sometimes in these cases, the actually just being called out like that, the changeling would flee at having been discovered. And those are the pernicious stories that suggest that there was something besides just misrecognized medical conditions in these stories. I mean, obviously the changeling legend was used to kill children, quite frankly. But there are these stories where the changelings behave quite differently than you would expect from any sort of child with a developmental disability. And in these methods where they talk or they laugh or they remark on their age, that doesn't quite fit that common theory that we're solely dealing with misrecognized medical conditions.
Now, when these children were supposedly taken, where were they supposed to be held at?
So the simple answer is fairyland, but what does that mean?
Mm-hmm.
There's a strong correlation, which I think is sort of a hint as to, it's sort of where I'm leaning with my own sort of paranormal concepts of what's going on with all these different phenomena. But setting that aside for now, there's a strong fairy correlation with the dead. And because of this, they would often be found at ancient ruins, again, very similar to the jinn in the Middle East, ancient ruins, burial mounds, and the like. And because of that, it was often claimed that fairyland was subterranean. But you'll never really find, you'll find plenty of stories where people descend into a fairy mound and they'll enter into fairyland. But, it almost sort of reads like stories talking about people descending into another dimension.
Okay. Interesting. Huh. Well, you also got into supernatural abduction and witches, demons, entities, and you were talking about the Asiatic, African, and Latin American cultures. I'm not going to have you explain all of it unless you really want to. But what are the most interesting? What are the most interesting aspects of that you found?
I think my favorite changeling that isn't a changeling sort of analog is the Abiku, which is this tradition of the Yoruba who live in Nigeria and Benin in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
It's generally claimed that the Abiku are most active at sunrise or sunset, the sort of liminal period that we were talking about, neither daytime nor nighttime. And if you were a pregnant woman, you should avoid certain spots that they might linger, dung heaps, jungles, footpaths. And if you were a woman who was unfortunate enough to encounter this Abiku, this disembodied spirit, it would actually find its way into your unborn child. Now, before incarnating in its human form, the Abiku actually in Yoruba mythology makes a pledge to live a shortened lifetime, but during that time to sort of milk the parents out of all the worldly goods that they can, because the idea of that accumulating worldly goods and offerings in the real world will translate to sort of wealth in the spirit world. So generally the way that these narratives go is that this child who isn't a child will present with a lot of the similar sort of complaints that you'd find in changeling lore of the British Isles. And the parents would take it to a babalawo, a fairy doctor, for advice. And eventually the parents would just see their child continuing to diminish in health and would start putting offerings at its feet, saying, oh, if you just release my child, I'll give you food, I'll give you money, I'll give you livestock, I'll give you property. And supposedly the idea is that after the abiku dies, or after the child dies, the abiku spirit is released and it takes all that wealth with it. It's interesting. One of the things that you find as sort of a preventative method in the British Isles is the presence of iron as a means of warding off both the supernatural in general, but specifically fairies. And it was seen that the abiku could also enter the bodies of newborn children. So one good way to prevent these spirits from entering the child's body was to actually hang iron rings around the children's ankles. So it's, again, some of these comparative things that are really startling when you sort of take a larger view to see how many of these traditions really have similar analogs, even though these are cultures that should not have any real contact with each other. Again, like I said, the jinn lore of the Middle East is another favorite of mine, but I could tell you the stories, but they're pretty much exactly like fairy lore. I mean, if you even you can even look at the way that both the jinn and the fairies are depicted in popular culture as sort of these friendly spirits. It's an exact same path, and they have a lot of similar attributes among themselves.
Now, these West African mythologies, are they tied anywhere into the voodoo culture?
From what I'm familiar with voodoo, and I'm speaking a little bit outside of my particular wheelhouse, but I should think that some of these Yoruba traditions would have found their way into that culture as well. I mean, so even if not just the Yoruba, the Igbo of southern Nigeria have an analogous entity as well that's very similar to the Abiku. So it would not surprise me at all.
No, the reason I asked was, of course, the West African religion was brought over with slaves into the, to form the Creole religions in the Caribbean, and it does sound like some type of beliefs that are inherent in Haitian voodoo and some of the other islands in the Caribbean. So I was just wondering if you found that correlation.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, there's a strong influence of Yoruba religion both on Haitian voodoo and New Orleans hoodoo beliefs.
So let's get to North America, the First Nations peoples, and their beliefs on these abductions. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
It's really startling. I was not expecting to find quite the same, robust traditions as I did in other parts of the world, and I certainly wasn't expecting to have them line up as well as they do with other lore. But I mean, it's actually one of the larger sections in that chapter on fairy traditions and changeling traditions and child abduction around the world is the sort of Native American component. One of the ones that I found most interesting, because this is happening, this is sort of the tribe that I was most familiar with growing up in central western North Carolina, are the Catawba Indians and their belief in the Yehasuri, which are what they refer to as wild Indians. And if you look at sort of their attributes, they're generally considered to live underground, be short, eat rubbish, which we talked about, braid horses' manes, which you'll find in fairy lore, especially in France. But interestingly enough, you'll also find people blaming Bigfoot for that, as I'm sure you're aware. And also, they love to take children away.
Right.
And there are certain stories of children who were taken away or who had these interactions, and they were brought back, and they would actually gain special abilities to be healers. Which is something that I think is really important, that I think gets overlooked so much, is that if you look at the same things can be said for medicine men / shamans in indigenous cultures. It can be said for alien experiencers. It can be said for people who return from fairyland, and it can be said for near-death experiencers. They all return, generally speaking, many of them return with some sort of heightened psi ability and a renewed spiritual interest and renewed abilities. You'll find this time and time again. And it doesn't get as much attention as I think it really should in the modern paranormal dialogue. But it's definitely a data point that I think is important.
Well, part of my family is from Western North Carolina, and they used to talk about child abductions by the wild men. Well, basically, they'd be describing Sasquatch and Bigfoot.
Boogers, right?
Yeah, and that those stories. I don't know how far back they go. I'm quite sure they go back to the Cherokee and other indigenous tribes in that region. But there is quite a tradition of children said to have been abducted by these, like you call boogers, or what we call now Bigfoot. And I'm just wondering how much that has to tie in with the David Paulides and his 411 encounters in his books. And, in particular, he talks about the national parks. But, this is something that I believe is kind of going on everywhere where this activity goes on.
Yes, I think part of the reason that I was inspired to write this book, too, was to sort of highlight how much fairy lore really informs a lot of these concepts. I mean, even
right.
the term booger, which I mentioned in the book, booger derives from boogeyman, which derives from boggart, which is a type of fairy that steals children. Like, you'll find a lot of these similar motifs really repeating themselves, and it's not. Look, Lon, I want Bigfoot to be flesh and blood so bad, but the similarities between a lot of the Sasquatch lore that you hear and fairy lore is startling. Their ability to paralyze people, just like elf shot might have in the British Isles, the braiding of horses that I mentioned, the suckling of milk, the stealing of milk from cattle, certain associations with the dead in some cultures. A lot of these are really interesting connections. I don't know if that means that there is some sort of Sasquatch fairy connection, but I think there are things that are deserving of our attention. And similarly, this sort of sanitization that you find of fairy lore in the modern sort of pop culture is one of the reasons that I think people haven't been considering it as a method, or a means rather, to explain at least some of these missing 411 disappearances.
Right.
One of the things that you'll find that is so I've said this before, but I think it's worth saying again. Missing 411 is a paranormal Rorschach test. Whatever you're into is what you're going to see. Now, honestly, I see the irony in me being into fairy lore and seeing fairies, but hear me out. Some of these data points that don't seem to make as much sense, like, the idea that, it's alien abduction because aliens will abduct you. Well, then why do so many disappearances have these weird weather effects? Why do they take place near boulder fields? Why do they take place while berry picking? But in the British and Irish and Scottish fairy lore, in particular, you'll find other ideas around the world. These are all things that are incorporated into fairy belief. The idea that, there's a book on my shelf that has an entire essay dedicated to stories of children who go berry picking in Newfoundland, where there was a strong fairy belief, and either saw fairies at the berry bush, were attempted to be kidnapped, were kidnapped and came back, or came back in a daze, which are all things that are missing 411 motifs. Similarly, in Iceland and other places in Scandinavia, boulder fields were the homes of fairies. And a lot of these traditions, from the Native Americans to the Middle Eastern cultures to the British Isles, fairies traveled on storms. They traveled on whirlwinds. And this, when you combine all this with the propensity of these beings in a lot of these different cultures to steal people, it's an explanation, as out there as it sort of sounds. Here's the thing. I don't know what the fairy faith was describing.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know what's happening in Missing 411. But setting aside, I think they're the same thing. I don't know that. Does this mean is Josh saying that fairies are abducting people? No, I'm not. I'm just saying that this was their way of describing the missing 411 phenomena, and our missing 411 phenomena is our way of describing the way that people would go missing in fairyland. And you can just go down the list. I mean, there's a really, I sort of try to delineate this in the book. A lot of Pilatus's data points you can find a 1-to-1 correlation with in some sort of fairy lore in the world.
Yeah, now you're talking about Bigfoot or Sasquatch being flesh and blood. Well, I don't buy into that for the most part either. You're actually preaching to the choir when you talk about some type of either interdimensional or supernatural aspect of these cryptids. I mean, there are just too many instances that are just too weird. I mean, unexplainable. People following and they just disappear into nowhere, or possibility of them being abducted. And I know David Pillay doesn't like talking about it because he and I have had arguments about this before too. But I think some of these cases are actually abductions by Bigfoot or Sasquatch, but he doesn't like to get into that.
Well, I have a problem with. Okay, look. First and foremost, my heart is in cryptozoology and the objective reality of Bigfoot as a flesh and blood creature, because I really want that to be the case. But I have a problem with certain researchers out there who will listen to you all day long about interacting with Sasquatch and will say, well, these are the not crazy people. But as soon as you bring in anything a little bit weird, well, then you're one of the crazies. Well, we all live in glass houses here. I mean, I think there's a real sort of intellectual dishonesty to sort of, I mean, obviously some things will push your suspension of disbelief too far. But if somebody says that they saw anomalous lights in the woods just prior to or after their sighting of Sasquatch, that's a data point. I'm sorry, you've got to hold on to that. If you would think their story isn't crazy without that one anomalous data point, you got to bring it in, and you got to.
That's an interesting point, because I have had more researchers who I've known for years who completely discounted the supernatural aspect to Bigfoot, starting to see these lights before and after Bigfoot encounters.
I think that this is sort of part of a larger cultural trend. And here we go off the rails, but I love it. The UFO community is moving in a general way away from these strict extraterrestrial hypothesis that you really have seen dominate the field for the past couple of decades. Even in the time that I've been really involved writing books, I've seen it move a little bit more away from that. You've got people who were sort of hardcore nuts and bolts sort of researchers like Richard Dolan, who are entertaining ideas about psi phenomena and consciousness and all these really interesting and exciting things. And I think you're sort of seeing a little bit of a parallel of that, I hope, in the Bigfoot community. For the longest time, I've said that, cryptozoology, again, love cryptozoology as I do, they're sort of the last people who are going to get on this consciousness bandwagon that everybody's hopping onto. But I see that changing a little bit, and there are certain researchers like yourself, like our friend Tim Renner, who I think are really on the bleeding edge of talking about these weirder things because they're data points and they have to be addressed. Even if they're completely separate things, you've got to look at the company that these things keep. And if you have these weird phenomena all manifesting in some area, it implies some sort of other thing that's drawing them there, if they're not all the same thing.
Well, when you talk to people every day about this kind of stuff and they're looking to you for answers, and you gotta start thinking that there's something else going on. Of course, I had a encounter with a Bigfoot back in '81, which is completely flesh and blood to me. And but I'm not discounting the fact that this very well may be a supernatural phenomenon as well. I mean, I don't argue that there aren't any flesh and blood, because I think there are in certain locations, certain areas.
Exactly.
But I also believe the theory that the supernatural and the paranormal is tied together somehow. In other words, UFOs, cryptids, spiritual world, etc. I think there's a tie-in somewhere. There's just too many things that go on that can't. I mean, it's hard to explain otherwise.
Well, and I think the problem is it's especially pronounced in these fields of study of Forteana nowadays. It shouldn't be, because this is the exact sort of thing that Fort would have railed against. But we all want to set up these dichotomies in anything that we do. It's all one thing or all the other thing. And I think with a lot of this stuff, you can't say that. I mean, are some UFOs unorthodox craft? Probably a lot of them. Secret government projects, probably a lot of them. Are some of them misidentification? Probably even more of them. Are some of them genuine extraterrestrial visitation? Yeah, I would say probably. Yeah, I would also say that some of them are some sort of psi phenomena. Some of them might have this sort of association with the spirit world. But people don't want to sit with that sort of ambiguity. And the thing that I think I might have mentioned this last time, but I really like it because it sort of explains where I sit with Sasquatch, is that if you're familiar with Mike Clelland's work, there are owls and then there are owls. So this idea that abductees will see owls that are flesh and blood owls, and it'll just be this sort of weird this sort of weird synchronicity. We've caught owls. We know that owls are actually animals, but sometimes they'll see owls that behave in a way that they should not, or owls that look like owls but are way too big. And I think maybe we're seeing something with Sasquatch. I'm completely open to the idea that there's a population of undiscovered primate, but sometimes whatever this other thing is, it says to itself, that's kind of a good mask to wear. Let's put that on for a while. That's the only that's the way that I have it reconciled in my head. Now, I hope I don't hold on to that belief for too long, because I think that when you sort of get ossified in your beliefs, that's always the sign that you're not moving forward. So hopefully that'll change sometime soon. But that's sort of where I sit with that concept right now.
Well, I've gone through this owl phenomenon myself, and in fact, I've got Mike Cleveland coming on the show in several weeks from now, and we're going to definitely be talking about that. And I can't explain it myself. It was a period of time there. For about a year and a half, where I was just seeing all references to owls, seeing owls, all kinds of different owl-related phenomena, and I couldn't explain it. And it was interesting because at the time, or right after that, I had gotten the chance to talk to Mike, and he and I talked about this extensively. And it's interesting. It kind of gets into as far as I'm concerned, the possibility of tulpa, thought form type manifestation. Is that what's going on with Bigfoot and other cryptids? That very well may be.
Yeah, completely open to that idea. And I think I specifically remember that conversation that you had with Mike. And if memory serves, was that around the time that your wife passed? Is that?
Yes, about that time.
And that's something that you'll find in a lot of these cultures, is that association of sort of being the owl as being, at the very least, a symbol between our world and the other world. And I think that's really, really interesting timing. I remember that it was such a moving and poignant moment that I can actually tell you exactly where I was in my day and where I was going when I heard that. Yeah,
it was something that was completely new to me, because it was interesting, because I had talked to Butch Wachowski, my associate, about this at the time, and I kept telling him, Butch, I keep seeing these owls. I keep seeing this thing about owls, or reading about owls, or something about an owl always comes up. And I didn't understand what it was. I talked to Leonard Dan, who's a shaman. Well, he's an elder, a Navajo elder, and he talked to me about about how owls were seen as a portent to bad tidings, basically in the Navajo tradition. But then then later on, I got to talk to Mike, and it kind of made a lot of sense that these may be some type of messengers of some type that are telling us not just bad things, but a lot of different things that may be coming, into our lives, and it made a lot of sense, and it seemed to stop as soon as, and in fact, my grandmother had passed like a month after my wife did. And after that occurred, because my father had the same thing happen to him, owls started showing up to him, because they lived beside each other, and he started seeing it as well. But then it went away after she passed away.
That's really fascinating, and that familial component I think is important too. Yeah, I suspect that time will be very kind to certain people, and amongst those, I suspect are people like Jacques Vallée and Mike Clellan, because I feel like, again, like some of these people like yourself that are talking about these sort of odder aspects, he doesn't shy away from it and is just trying to find a way to embrace it. And I actually heard an interview with Mike that was one of the warmest, most nuanced interviews I've heard in a long time. He did a really, really great job. And anyway, this is the Love Mike Clelland hour on Arcane Radio.
No, I really respect Mike. I mean, his first book was phenomenal, and he just picked up where he left off in the second book. But I was glad I was able to talk to him about this, because it's something I actually experienced. I experienced a lot of different things.
Well, and the thing that I admire him the most for, and this is sort of steering us back on track a little bit, I guess, is that he has had some really profoundly unambiguous and profoundly weird experiences, but he refuses to put them into a box. He still has wiggle room. He has some strong suspicions, but and that's what I think that a lot of us should aspire to, because if he can do that with the experiences that he's had, having seen what we would call grays and having had these other things happen, these things are strongly suggestive of alien abduction. If he can still sit with that and say, I've got some suspicions, but I don't know, then those of us who don't have this sort of thing happen to us every day can at the very least be as open-minded as someone like him.
Well, let's get into the extraterrestrial hypothesis. I'm talking like alien hybrid agendas. When I talk about that, I think like Brett Oldham and his story, missing fetuses, anomalous pregnancies. What's your thoughts on that?
So I've been really resistant to that concept for a while, because if you take it from a purely scientific standpoint, there shouldn't be any sort of ability for us to interbreed with a species from another planet.
Right.
And of course I know that any sufficiently advanced technology would appear like magic. Well, yes, in that case, magic would also appear like any sufficiently advanced technology. So I think that if you really pull out sort of the ways that there are ways that a lot of this sort of hybrid program motifs sort of really do echo the changeling phenomenon. I mean, the most obvious thing that has been pointed out ad nauseum, and I'm not the first person to say this, is the appearance of these hybrids oftentimes look just like changelings would have. They'd be thin. They'd have tiny arms and legs. A lot of changelings had large eyes and large heads. They'd be listless and wouldn't want to do anything. These are the exact same descriptions that you get from these hybrids. Similarly, there's this encouragement for these mothers when they're in this baby presentation scenario. They've been taken aboard the craft in modern abduction literature by the aliens. The aliens always say, hold it, nurse it. Well, holding and nursing are two things that you find in changeling lore as well. I mean, there's a very common Irish motif that you'll find in other parts of the British Isles of the midwife to the fairies, which is where a woman is taken to help a fairy mother give birth. And in all these cases, she has to touch the mother in order for it to give birth. Similarly, that concept of nursing at a human breast is exactly what we talked about in the changeling phenomena earlier. Sometimes these motifs express themselves in interesting ways. If you've got something like these concepts of star children or indigo children, these ideas that they're alien human hybrids living among their parents, it's sort of an inversion of the changeling narrative, because now the parents are the ones who don't belong there. So you can find these things if you look at it. Basically, what I try to do is I try to look at it as a folklorist, but believe in it like an anomalist, basically.
Yeah.
Because I think that's whatever we're dealing with, these sort of phenomena, I think that's what they do. I think they're inside our heads. And I think that they will take these things and make them conform and adapt to our cultures. And it's no more apparent really than in the alien hybrid program that you see in literature. One of the things that I thought was really interesting is that you'll actually find some specific examples of children who are basically changelings. I mean, there was one story that Jenny Randall's talked about, who was an abductee whose child was sitting in the baby carriage and suddenly began crying. And she said that she knew at that moment her child had received an alien soul. Well, that's the changeling narrative right there.
Right.
There's another one that I thought was really interesting. I'm a big fan of Carla Turner's work, and she, in several books, discussed the case of Ted Rice. And he remembered when he was 8 years old, he was taken up in this giant storm to what he believed was a UFO, and he met entities who took his soul out of one body and placed it in the other body and returned him home on this whirlwind. Well, the whirlwind is something you find as a means of travel in fairy lore, as we talked about earlier, and this idea of his cloned body being sort of a changeling body. I mean, these are all motifs that really do express themselves time and time again.
Mm.
And we scratched the surface, folks. I promise there's more. There's more.
A lot there. Now one thing I do want to talk about before we go is a modern phenomenon, this Slender Man thing. And you do kind of talk about it in the book a bit. I personally believe it's a thought form. But when you start talking about thought forms, I mean, these things can really manifest into something pretty bad. I mean, you talk about poltergeist phenomena. That's exactly what it is. So is the Slender Man another type of a poltergeist that, people or kids for the most part are imagining being abducted? And in the case in Wisconsin where these two girls attempted to murder this other girl for Slender Man.
Yeah, I suspect that you're right in a lot of cases. And I suspect also that, again, this idea of whatever this is more tied to us than even we realize. I mean, a lot of normalists and anomalists like to poo-poo the idea that perhaps we're just dealing with some sort of exteriorization of our subconscious or something along those lines. But it's still fascinating if that's the case. I mean, oh my God, that's reality changing. So I suspect that whenever you get people really pushing back against the tulpa idea, which I've not always been a fan of in the past, but I've come around to, I suspect that they're probably rejecting something like that. I suspect that the types of entities that people see, being so wide and varied. I mean, take a look at this Albert Rosales' work if you don't believe me. The things that people see are so wide and varied and bizarre. I think there has to be a component of that involved. There has to be some sort of a term that my good friend Greg Bishop uses a lot, some sort of co-creative component of us feeding this, whatever these things are, images that mean something to us or something to our culture. And I think that the Slender Man is probably a really good example of that. There's something weird about Slender Man that you can't just write off and ascribe to pop culture. That's for sure.
Well, I believe it's more of an internet phenomenon than anything else. It's something that, if it wasn't for the internet, it probably wouldn't even started. And, I think we can expect more of these, in fact. These memes turning into a possible entity of some type. Is it wishful thinking on my part? I don't know. Maybe it's something I want to see, but I don't know.
I think that might be tied into the fact that we don't exactly know what we're creating with the internet yet. I think that it's evolving into something, and I don't know. If we can do that, if we can have some sort of effect on our reality with our brains, how complex does artificial intelligence and or the internet have to become before it can have similar effects?
So Josh, why don't you tell everybody where they can get a hold of you and what do you have planned in the future? What's going on? Do you have any conferences or such you're going to be at, or do you have another book in the works?
I can be found at joshuacutchin.com. All the books can be found on Amazon or Barnes & Noble, or, bug your local book retailer too, if you want to, your brick and mortar retailer if you have one. As far as what I have in the future, I'm toying with a couple of different ideas, and I really don't know where I want to go next. I've got an idea for a fiction book. I've got an idea for another book on, non-speculative nonfiction on the paranormal. I'm not really sure yet. I'm still trying to bask in the glow of having this done and out the door. As far as appearances, I have some stuff coming up in the new year. For some reason, I don't get invited to a lot of conferences. Maybe because I don't toe the party line. But
I'm in the same boat there, my friend. Believe me.
I do have some stuff that's coming up in the new year that I just want to be a little bit more firm before I make some announcements. But that'll be happening soon. So that's sort of the 411 on me.
Well, Joshua, thanks for coming on with me. You're always welcome to come back, and I look forward to reading and talking to you. And you take care and have a great weekend.
Thanks so much as well.
Now, before I go, allow me to leave this with the listeners. There are incidents that cause sudden upheaval and disorder in each of our lives. I've learned that it's not healthy to dwell on things you can't control. But on the other hand, the worst part of being lied to is knowing that in the eyes of someone you trusted, you weren't worth the truth. The truth may hurt, but doubt causes ruin and lies can destroy. Now, I thank everyone for their support and friendship. Good night and have a great weekend.